Welcome to the Book Show, a celebration of reading and writers. I'm Joe Donahue. Hailed by the Booker Prize judges as a, quote, fierce and philosophical interrogation of human existence, Charlotte Wood's Yard Devotional chronicles one woman's inward journey to make sense of the world and her life when conflicts and chaos are abundant in both realms. Yard Devotional examines what it means to be good, the nature of belief and forgiveness, and the sustained effect of grief on the human soul. Wood confronts many of our most profound questions, including how to reconcile the degradation of our world with our deepest values. Charlotte Wood is the author of 7 novels, including the international bestseller The Weekend, and 3 books of nonfiction. Again, the name of the new novel is Yard Devotional, and we welcome Charlotte Wood to this week's book show. Thank you very much for being with us. What a delight to have you on the program.
Thank you so much, Joe.
What brought you to the idea of such a meditative and quiet tale?
A whole lot of things sort of slowly coalesced, I guess, rather than me having an idea and then, writing it down. One of those things was that I started the book just before the pandemic exploded across the world. And in Australia, we had fairly severe lockdowns. So, I think I started the book with an idea of wanting to investigate why a contemporary woman might become a Catholic nun, because I've always found that such a kind of intriguing life choice. But I think it was much more sort of a bit noisier, I guess, the book as I began it. But then when we were in lockdown, the whole world seemed to be quietening down. And we also had that the rug of certainty was absolutely pulled out from under all of us. There was, what I call the great chastening that took place. We had just finished the worst bushfire season we'd ever had in Australia in 2019. We had been watching the wildfires in LA with absolute horror and recognition because we had similarly awful fires here. So we were kind of reeling from that as a country. Then the pandemic hit. So then there was another sort of onslaught of fear and uncertainty about, our our certainties about how we operated in the world were suddenly being pulled away from us in all directions. So I guess during those lockdowns, I suppose I went into a fairly introverted kind of space. And I was writing about a woman, leaving her contemporary city life to go and live in a cloistered order of nuns. So it sort of seemed to fit the material, but also the kind of vibe, I guess, of the world as it was happening around me.
The woman is middle aged, is not named in the novel, and is ultimately taking refuge in this community, which is really interesting because this is a woman who is not religious, not deeply religious, does not believe, correct?
Correct. Yeah, she almost sort of stumbles into this place as a place of refuge, as you said, initially just for a couple of days. Lots of monasteries, places like this do have guest houses where people can come and stay really for any reason, mostly probably for kind of spiritual reasons. But you can go and stay in a place like this and just lie down and go to sleep, which is what my woman does. She's sort of hit a wall of despair about her life's work as an environmental advocate. And there's sort of an unspecified crisis that happens before the book opens, but we understand that she has just sort of lost faith in her work, which is also her whole life. So she leaves her husband, her job, her marriage. But initially she goes to this place. She has no intention of participating in anything religious at all, but out of curiosity, after a couple of days, she goes and checks out the nuns where they come 7 times a day into the church. She kind of finds them faintly ridiculous and a bit embarrassing, that she thinks, what are these women doing out here in the middle of nowhere in Australia, praying and singing? And, what good is that doing in the world, is her initial thought. But then she thinks about her own life and all the kind of activism that she has so fervently devoted herself to, and has reached a point of thinking, well, what good has that done? So she kind of moves up and down between these two mantras, I guess, one of which is action is the antidote to despair, which is something I've always believed, something she's always believed. But the other one is first do no harm. And she looks at these women and thinks, well, maybe in there just staying here, staying still, not proselytizing, not going out into the world, not doing any harm, they've actually done more good than I have done with all my kind of relentless action. So she's chastened as well by suddenly looking at her own beliefs and thinking, maybe I'm wrong.
This is toward the beginning of the book. I think mice have been in the poultry feed, and this morning I found one of the baby chicks dead, killed by frost. Somehow it had strayed, was not hiding underneath its mother with the others. I picked it up, icy cold and light as a ping pong ball, and carried it away from the chick yard in my pocket. I dug a small hole behind the compost base for its burial. When I pushed the shovel blade into the hard ground, what came to me were the mass graves in which nuns, Irish, American, Canadian, why not also Australian, had buried babies they called illegitimate. I had a terrible picture of it, a long white habit flapping, a black boot on a shovel, a hole. When I dug my own hole, I reached into the pocket and crouched down to let the fluffy little body roll into it, filled it back in, pressed the earth down, said a small blessing to the chick, not a prayer, something I made up. Maybe it was a prayer. And I wanted to read that because I found it fascinating of the connection to the church, the knowledge that this woman has of the church, but also even being in the periphery, feeling that necessity to say a blessing or maybe even a prayer for that
Mm.
dead chick.
This is very early in the book, but she never loses that sort of tussle within herself about what am I doing here? The Catholic Church has done all these terrible things, and yet here I am. And
Mm.
she said, I think she even says, yet here I am, wrestle, wrestle. She's constantly thinking, you know, what's my part in this? What am I condoning by being here? And then thinking, well, what am I condoning by being anywhere else? She says at one point, every time I got out of bed, I was destroying the world, but, environmentally, she means. But also, I think she does kind of yearn for some sort of belief, even though she can't really ever bring herself to believe with a capital B in God. She sees that it brings value for some of the women there. Some of them she can't stand and she's really irritated by them. But the head of the monastery, a nun called Simone, my narrator has a lot of respect for her.
Mm.
She's a very rigorous, intelligent woman. And the narrator sees that there's something there that I just am reaching for, but I can't quite grasp. But she's always trying. And I think, in the secular world, sometimes we do have, there is something missing in terms of ritual. I grew up as a Catholic, as did my narrator, and that highly ritualized religious life, there's a lot, enormous comfort in that and enormous beauty sometimes, while still acknowledging all these other, really damaging things that religious institutions have done sometimes. But my narrator often says she doesn't understand prayer. She never kind of gets a hold of what it is, how to do it. She says, is it the same as meditating? Is it thinking? Is that what prayer is?
Mm.
But so when she says, I'd say a little something for this dead little chicken, it's not a prayer. Well, maybe it's a prayer. She doesn't really ever figure out what a prayer is. But I think she has a need in her, as many of us do, for some sort of ritual to mark important moments in our lives.
Charlotte Wood is our guest on this week's book show. The new novel is Yard Devotional. In that understanding of what is going on, the narrator seems to have, well, maybe irritated by some of the other nuns, does have a respect, right? Does have
Mm.
an interest and a respect in their belief and certainly the boundaries of that.
She does respect it, and she's grateful that they have let her come here, that without asking any questions. I mean, one of the things that she finds really kind of a bit confronting at the beginning is how you never really know anything. Nothing's ever answered properly for you. And she thinks they speak really slowly, and she's thinking, well, come on, what are you trying to say? But over time, she slows down. She starts to realize that there are some questions that will never be answered, and that is as it should be. So she does have enormous respect for some of them. One of the things that she is very confronted by is her own ego in this place. I think we kind of can romanticize a kind of cloistered life in a way where we think, oh, these people go and live this very simple life. It's full of peace and order. But what my narrator finds quite quickly is that there might be peace and order, but you are never going to escape the self. And in fact, you can leave the world, but the world will not really leave you. So she's often wrestling with her own ego, when she hears these sort of religious chanting and bits of the Bible, and her immediate impulse is to argue and to say, well, that's not right because X, Y, Z. But she realizes that actually my job here is to subdue my own ego, and that is extremely difficult for her.
In this small religious community that she becomes a part of, it does in many respects become a microcosm of the world and the dilemmas and the obstacles and the challenges that we all face.
Yeah, that's right. Because initially she does find this sort of very pleasantly ordered life where she doesn't have to make any decisions. The same thing happens at the same time every day, and there's a sort of comfort in that. But quite soon after the book opens, there are these sort of quite disturbing visitations. One of which is a plague of mice that takes over the countryside, which happened here in Australia while I was writing the book. And another one is the return of some skeletal remains of a nun who once lived there, but who went to Asia to work with poor women and then was murdered. Well, her bones have just been found, and they're being brought back to the monastery for burial. And the person who's bringing them back is a nun called Sister Helen Parry, who is a kind of radical activist nun. Some of the other women there, well, they don't want her there. They call her a celebrity nun. She's kind of a troublemaker. She speaks truth to power. She's got a bit of a media following, and she kind of brings into this place all the kind of energy and chaos of the world that these women have very deliberately left behind. So there's a culture clash just with her very arrival. But also, my narrator has a kind of very troubling relationship with her from the past.
Right.
So all this sort of trouble comes to find these women, whether they like it or not.
Well, Charlotte, let's begin with the mice. Oh my goodness, this is such a part of the book, and it is so beautifully written. But man, it can still be really gross. What was it like living through that and then writing about it in such a way? Because it is something that, as you say, of here is this character who is in seclusion, and there is an invasion from this species that has literally wormed its way in, both physically and also metaphorically.
From time to time in Australia, we have had these mouse plagues. And as I said, one happened while I was writing the book, not in the city where I live. So I didn't actually have to endure it myself, although I did go and stay with a friend who lives out in the country on a farm in the middle of this plague. And it was, everything in the book about the mice is just real. And in fact, there was a lot of stuff that was just too gross that I did not want to put in the book. But if you Google mouse plague Australia, you will see things that you don't want to see. But it sort of became very useful to me metaphorically because there's something very visceral and deep about a mouse plague I've discovered that I mean, when this book came out in the UK, people were just so horrified, and they thought I made it up, and I was like, no, this is real. But one of the things about plagues of mice here is that it's a sign of nature being out of balance, but it's also, these are British mice. These are not native to this country. They came over on the first fleet with the white settlers. So there's a whole lot of, sort of really implicit metaphors, I guess, about colonization, about the kind of mistreatment of nature that allows these things to develop. But I did go and stay with my friend for 2 days on her farm. And I only went because she promised me that the mice could not get into the bedroom that I was in, which was true, thank goodness. But it was very, very confronting. They will eat houses. I mean, you
Mm.
have to violently dispose of these creatures, which is an awful thing to do. But if you don't, they will literally eat your house. They eat concrete footings, they eat electrical wires. When I stayed with my friend, her oven didn't work anymore because they'd eaten electrical wires, and and the dishwasher the same. There's no point in replacing those things until the plague is over because they'll just destroy the next one. So it was also useful to me because these women who live their lives with an ethos of first do no harm are forced to do harm to these
Mm.
animals, and it's very distressing for everybody. I started it just because it seemed so kind of incredible, these stories that my friend was telling me, like waking up in the middle of the night and hearing the piano playing, which was mice in the piano. Um, and then, over time, I saw that it actually could be quite a useful sort of narrative device without hopefully leaning on it too heavily.
Through this, with the mice coming into this community, it becomes, it's a bonding exercise in a way amongst these women, the nuns and the narrator, them against the vermin.
Yeah, they have to cooperate in ways that, they have to kind of think of ways to dispose of the bodies of the mice. They have to set traps, endless times a day. And they also, very importantly, need to keep them out of the room where the bones of this dead nun are being held while they wait for permission to bury her on their land. So it's this sort of crisis of nature, crisis of ethics, and, a kind of tension builder at the same time. And it does bond them. It also bonds them with their neighbour, a farmer called Richard Gittins, who comes to help them. But it's also a cycle, that has to be gone through. They're sort of waiting for the end of this plague. They're waiting for rain that will, if there's enough rain, then that will end the mouse plague. But so there's a sort of, things are largely out of their hands, in terms of, what some people might say, what the gods will do. And in this case, what nature will do, and what the nuns hope God will do to help them.
Charlotte Wood is our guest. The name of the new novel is Yard Devotional. Did you always know that this character would remain nameless? You would not name the narrator?
I think I did decide it fairly early on, partly because the initial form of the book takes the form of a diary. So in the early stages, when she goes for this, short trip, it's a very literal kind of diary. She says day one, day two, day three, this is what happened. And then, when she goes back there to live, that sort of overt form falls away, and it's more of an internal sort of diary. Partly I thought, well, if she's writing a diary, she's not going to name herself to herself. She's not going to say, I, Charlotte Wood, arrived here today. But more on a deeper level, I was very intent from the outset not to have anything unnecessary in the book. I wanted a very spacious sort of narrative, what some people would call very, very spare, kind of austere in a way. And I just had a feeling quite early on that it's not necessary to name her. It's a very internal sort of story. You don't really ever see her from anyone else's point of view, although you can sort of gather hints here and there. But it's a very interior sort of book, and books that don't explain so much and that are quite interior are my favorite sorts of novels. Really, I love the work of people like Elizabeth Strout, a lot of the power of the book comes from a sort of quietude, I suppose, and that's something I wanted to investigate creatively for myself. So I sort of had a rule that I wasn't going to have anything that I thought was unnecessary in the book, and her name was one of those things.
You write about halfway through the book, a new year, the mice continue to worsen, and Helen Perry is still here like a trapped animal. That links the two, doesn't it? That the mice are infesting this community, and there is another trapped animal who is there, and that is Helen Perry, this nun, who can't wait to get out of there.
As I said, I was writing the book during the pandemic. Well, I know the pandemic isn't finished, but those early days. In the novel, COVID is kind of in the background of the story. It doesn't really affect these women because they don't go anywhere, they don't do anything, so they're not. They don't really have to deal with the kind of restrictions that the rest of us did in lockdown because they already live like that. But Helen Parry comes there. In Australia, we had very severe travel restrictions. So getting in and out of the country was extremely difficult. So Helen Parry arrived there, and because of these travel restrictions, she can't leave when she wants to. And she's constantly on Zoom calls and doing media stuff and kind of, advocating for human rights and environmental protests and all sorts of things. But she cannot physically leave, and she doesn't want to be there. They don't really want her there. She's an incredible force, this woman, in the world. And there are these nuns around the world. I kind of think of them as kind of rogue operators, where
Mhm.
they are extremely powerful, doing very courageous work. Going to jail, protesting, standing up for voiceless people. Um, and I was interested in the way that sometimes people, well, my impression that people who change the world for the better are often not the easiest people to hang out with, right? So, if you're going to stand up to dictators, you're going to have the kind of courage and troublemaking impulse that might not make you, the most pleasant dinner companion. So Helen Parry is one of these people.
You actually write in the book, I flagged the quote, "It's been my observation over many years that those who most powerfully resist convention quite peacefully accept the state of being reviled."
Yeah, I have noticed that in sort of, I guess, in the media mostly. I don't personally know anyone who's a massive troublemaking activist, but I know that there are people who, say, for instance, might be lobbying for voluntary assisted dying or something like that. I know there's one activist we have in Australia who has been so viciously attacked over the years. And whenever I see this person in the media, they seem to have a very peaceful acceptance of this, as I wrote, state of being reviled. And I think there are a lot of people who, and I've seen it in environmental activists who are, often jailed or whatever, they just accept it as part of their kind of mission, and yet they're still so attacked by people who don't want them to do the work they're doing. So yeah, Helen Parry is one of those sorts of people.
I mentioned in the introduction you examining the sustained effect of grief, and there's very much of the narrator and her mother, and that is so strong, and I also very universal, and yet so incredibly powerful.
Well, thank you, Joe. Well, the strand of the novel that is about the narrator and her mother is very, very autobiographical. The rest of it is completely invented, but my parents died when I was in my 20s, as did the narrators. And I wanted to kind of look at my mother, I guess, in fiction. And the mother in the book is a portrait of my mother, and the relationship between the daughter and her. It's a very kind of narrow portrait, necessarily because my mother had five children, and in the book there's only one child, so automatically that's not a full portrait of a person. But I was sort of interested in trying to portray a loving mother-daughter relationship, which is kind of quite difficult sometimes. We're kind of used to explorations of damaging parental child relationships, and it seemed to me less common to have a kind of portrayal of the relationship of the kind that the narrator and her mother does, but also was interested in that long experience of grief and how there's sometimes a sort of shame attached to the fact that grief goes on and on, so I'm nearly 60, and my parents died when I was in my 20s, and I have carried for a long time a sort of shame that I haven't got over it. It certainly changes texture, and it's easier to manage over time, but there are times, and I'm sure that perhaps you and people listening will have had that experience of a long ago grief suddenly overwhelming them at some unexpected time. It there are waves of grief, I think, and some of them just reverberate for a very long time. So I wanted to explore that a little. There's some exploration in the book of the fact that the narrator's mother is a very, very private person. And so there's a slight unknowability about her that has always remained. I mean, my narrator respects that, as I respected in my mother, that she just needed to have. And I didn't ever think, you shouldn't be so private, or why don't I know you better? With my father, and the narrator says this, with her father, she knew him from the moment she was born. She would never have known him any better if he'd lived a long time. Whereas with her mother, there's a slight sense of maybe over time I would have got to know her better, but maybe not. She was just that sort of person.
Charlotte Wood's new novel is Yard Devotional. It's published by Riverhead Books. Charlotte, what a delight to speak to you. I thank you so much for spending time with us and for writing such a gorgeous novel.
Well, thank you so much, Joe. I've loved the conversation.
Again, Charlotte Wood's new novel is Yard Devotional, published by Riverhead Books. Thanks to our producer, Sarah LeDuc. Write to us at book@wamc.org. The latest on National Productions programs is available via the Airwaves newsletter at wamc.org and on social media at WAMC Radio. Bookmark us for next week.